Okay, today we're going to be reading Just Because by Matthew McConaughey. This is illustrated by Renee Carilla. Just Because by Matthew McConaughey. Just because they threw a dart doesn't mean that it's stuck. Just because I've got skills doesn't mean there is no luck. Just because they let you down doesn't mean you gotta get low. Just because they're clumsy doesn't mean they have no flow. Just because you answer doesn't mean you heed the call. Just because I'm at the top doesn't mean I cannot fall. Just because I let go doesn't mean that I stop climbing. Just because I mean it doesn't mean that I'm not lying. Just because I'm finished doesn't mean that I'm done. Just because you got the gold doesn't mean that you won. Just because you wrote it doesn't mean that I read it. Just because I did it again doesn't mean I don't regret it. Just because you can pull it off doesn't mean that you should do it. Just because you failed doesn't mean that you blew it. Just because they say it's so doesn't mean it happened to me. There's how I see it, how you see it, and what will come to be. Just because you threw shade doesn't mean I'm out of the sun. Just because they shut me down doesn't mean I have not won. Just because you're wailing doesn't mean that you're a crier. Just because I lied doesn't mean that I'm a liar. Just because they can choose doesn't mean you have a choice. Just because they don't hear you doesn't mean you have no voice. Just because it's silent doesn't mean that it's not loud. Just because you're alone doesn't mean there's not a crowd. Just because I'm dirty doesn't mean I can't get clean. Just because you're nice doesn't mean you can't get mean. Just because I'm going in circles doesn't mean that I'm dizzy. Just because I'm sitting still doesn't mean that I'm not busy. Just because we're friends doesn't mean that you can't burn me. Just because I'm stubborn doesn't mean that you can't turn me. Just because I forgive you doesn't mean I still trust. There's what you do, there's what I do, and yours is not my must. Just because it's fiction doesn't mean it can't be true. Just because you want one more doesn't mean that you need two. Just because you're a bully doesn't mean you're strong. Just because it felt right then doesn't mean it won't feel wrong. Just because a hand is clenched doesn't mean that it's a fist. Just because I'd rather not doesn't mean I don't take risks. Just because I'm in the race doesn't mean I'm fully ready. Just because you're shaking doesn't mean that you're not steady. Just because you follow doesn't mean you're not a leader. Just because I keep winning doesn't mean that I'm a cheater. Just because we disagree doesn't mean that you're not right. And just because it's dark doesn't mean that it's night. Just because the sun has set doesn't mean it will not rise. Because every day is a gift, each one a new surprise. Believe it.